My name's Jason Mauck. I farm in Gaston, Indiana, kind of the middle of the state, further towards the east. And we farm mostly corn and soybeans and wheat. And we have a bunch of livestock with pigs. Some of our uncles do some 4-H animals. One of my uncles has some cattle. What I'm presenting about is intercropping, what I'm doing on our farm to basically manage our manure. We have a lot of manure. Things have kind of manifested over the last 20 years, kind of new problems or opportunities, the way that you look at it. So I'll just kind of share kind of what we do with that. Well, thank you for inviting me here. Lauren said yesterday he felt like the choir boy talking in front of the Pope. I really feel like Dennis Rodman. If you look at my main slide here, 3 years of mistakes. Very important here is the 3 because this is all new to me. I am marinated in sin. Our farm still does some tillage, and I am the guy that's trying to convince the change and trying these experimentals on our farm to see the direction of our farm. So I just want to put that out there right off the bat, and that is what makes this more frustrating than anything is when you come to these things, when you do experiments on your farm, you see the change, and then you have to go backwards. And I really liked Gabe's speech last night, and it really made it tough to go into what I'm going to be talking about. With our farm, we have a lot of pigs. They are confined. A saying that I say is a man is as faithful as his options, and that does not mean, men, you need to just start flirting with every lady here. To me, experimentation opens the door to our options. So with each experiment that I do, with each story that people share, with all these things going on in your mind, the most important thing to do is to go back to your farm and start trying things and not worry about the scale. Maybe it's just in your garden, maybe it's a 1-acre plot, but trying as many things as possible, ditching these schematics and all the, you might have to kind of think outside the box, do some different things. I think that's where you learn and actually open up more options for the future. So my background is as a landscape contractor. My mom told me when I was in high school, she said, son, corn's $1.70, beans are, I think they were down to like $4.50 a bushel. There's no money in farming. Go get you an education and get a real job. So I was in sales for a little bit, sold some insurance. I hated the city, hated the office. I wanted to get my hands dirty, so we started a landscape contracting business here in my hometown. Got to move back home, help on the farm. And that really kind of set the stage for my thought process in the future. And this is just our sign here on the farm. And that's where I really learned about sun capture and staging. And if you look at these little marigolds up front, if you notice this is one ginormous plant, there's about 7 plants there. And when I became a landscape contractor, we had probably 20 or 30 businesses that we took care of, and we had to make these big flower arrangements for them. And I found this huge value in sticking plants in the ground way before anybody else thought of in the frost with pansies. We could kind of protect them from frost, and I could buy a flat of flowers from a wholesaler for about $7. So I had about 10 cents per plant. I could stab them in the ground with a 9/16" wrench. And the main goal is if we had $10,000 worth of flowers, our cost of production was down to just a couple $100. There wasn't much risk. So thinning them out and getting a bigger plant really added to our profitability. And then we tried to get blooms throughout the whole growing season. So I was kind of transported from that business with a bunch of personal freedom into the farm through a really bad circumstance. My dad got pancreatic cancer in the summer of 2010, and I was asked to kind of come and fill his shoes. We lost him the next spring, and I was going from that straight into the hog barns, the sprayer, putting the crop out, and I did everything that I could to absorb as much information as possible. I had the background in farming, but I really first looked at the Hefty brothers, kind of that idea mindset, and then I really started getting onto social media and getting kind of this mindset. And that's really where I'm hoping the future goes. So we built a family, me and my wife. We've got a 2, and this little boy just turned 4. And he can really put the corn down. And again, we've got 25,000 pigs we finish in a year, 12,000 at once. So we have a copious amount of exported nutrients that come to our farm. And let's get this playing. Give you a little video of our kids here right off the bat. And this will kind of set the stage. All right, let's go. So aside from our field trials,
we're still producing ears.
I do a lot of experimentation just in our garden, just to see the whole spectrum.
Hey,
and the thing that I've become fascinated with is plant flex. And what I've boiled it down to is each plant will produce according to the amount of sunlight that it can capture.
1, 2, count with me.
So this is a single seed planted in the garden with ample space all the way around it.
5, there's one there. 6, 7, 8.
We're going to let them all count out, but there's 31 ears produced from this one corn plant.
10.
And basically what happens in your field, when you're in a multiculture situation, and as we have been told to plant more and more seeds, and it becomes in a competition, what has happened with that single corn plant.
30.
Instead of it driving its total yield production off the top 2 leaves, the corn recognized its space early. It grew 2 sucker plants. Each individual node had a leaf connected to it that brought in more energy, and each node began producing ears. And once the ears came out, it recognized the space and sunlight, and leaves started growing on the ears themselves, which triggered another ear on the same node. So you had a main corn plant with 2 ears on every node, a sucker with, and we ended up with 31, and the whole reproduction process lasts about a 2-month period. So that kind of mindset really opened my eyes with this relay intercropping. A lot of the research in our area through Ohio State has been in these 15-inch rows. What if we continuously widen these rows to try to leverage plant flex and have 2 crops not really recognize each other and kind of trigger this phenomenon in different timing to produce more and lower our input costs? Okay, we're finally done with the music here. But the other problem that we're really seeing, if you rewind here, 50, 60 years ago, every farm, I call it nuclear. We milked cows, we had pigs, we had some horses. Our farm had fences. And, at the beginning here, forgive me, I forget his name, but he talked about what ruined the small towns was the pavement, because we could go to the town and shop. Well, I think what has ruined our diversity is we've taken all our fences out. And the reason why we've taken all our fences out is commercial fertilizer became so cheap. And as we went in the past, the more we produced, we had a lot more margins. So our grandfathers were just, the co-op guy just put it in their head, keep putting that fertilizer out there, producing more. And there was many years there where we saw these incremental gains in wealth. And now we've got to this point where we've consolidated all our livestock, we're confining them, and we cannot build. We want to build a hog barn on another farm. We cannot do that. The neighbors came together and they have shut down our ability to build another barn. We may be able to do it here in a couple years, but we are stacking these barns in the same place. And what happens is you have a barn that's bringing in 2,000 or 3,000 acres worth of crops, and you're probably not going to deposit that manure on those same acres. And the same acres keep getting it and getting it. So when I came back to the farm, we had our soil test, something that was rarely done. And the soil guy said, your fertility is just through the roof. What have you guys been doing? And Grandpa says, well, we don't really trust the manure, so we've been pumping the anhydrous and P and K to it at the same time. And we just have these tremendous fertility values. And it really starts going negative. We start tying up some micronutrients. We get acidic. So we got right on the ball of variable rating our lime, stop putting manure onto makers, stop putting dry fertilizer, and trying to get this balanced and trying to logistically move it. So I was looking for systems that we could kind of change, and maybe we could actually leverage the situation instead of kind of degrading our soils. So this is kind of out there, and you'll, if you talk to me much, you'll get a lot of that. But when I was a landscape contractor, one thing we always noticed was when we would show up to the property, wherever the dog took a dump, the grass is really tall, and that's super primitive, I know. But I have all this energy with manure. How can we capture that with a fall application? So we went towards the wheat. And wheat's kind of a stepchild in our area. It just, nobody wants to mess with it. People want to be at the lakes on the 4th of July. But I've been trying to integrate wheat in our rotation. Those small grains, we're really getting gains with our corn and so on. So that right there is a wheat plant with 64 heads off of one seed. So you saw the corn, you saw the wheat. We can do that both with this same kind of deal. So this was the first kind of go at it with relay cropping, and I made a huge mistake. I was so excited about it, and I got on Twitter, and I was talking about it all the time, but I didn't really know what I was doing. And the main variable that I really didn't calculate well was the energy in manure. And I thought, as I widen these wheat rows, we're going to give up yield if we don't continue to feed it. So I got out my equipment and gave it some more nitrogen. And what happened basically was the wheat got so thick, it was great, but there was no light for the soybeans. And at the time, wheat was priced in the mid-4s on the board. So it was okay. We had a really heavy rainfall in later August, so these beans still came back. We seeded some more after harvest, and we got about a 40 bushel bean crop. So it wasn't bad. But we came back to the drawing board for the next year. And the goal on, this would be the fall of 2016, was to take all our commercial inputs out of it as far as dry P&K and nitrogen, and we widened our wheat rows somewhat. So we've got 37.5-inch rows. You can see the imperfections here. We didn't use guidance. And I really like imperfections because it really multiplies the amount of observations that I have. I can, if I have a guess row a little bit wider or narrower, I don't have to make a separate experiment. So I kind of like that. And what we're doing here is we're polycropping. So we're applying this manure, and about 60% of the nitrogen in manure is pretty much just flammable. I mean, it's just gone. If you smell it, it's gone. So we're injecting it in the ground and polycropping a radish, and the next year we integrated oats to try to capture that in a plant and then be re-released to the wheat. So that really fights our weed pressure with offense. We can use that ammonium to get a quicker canopy, which outcompetes the winter annuals like purple henbit and chickweed that's pretty prevalent in our kind of nitrogen soils. So this is the next summer, and I just fell in love with the beauty of this. So I became just deeper and deeper, more interested. And I started seeing all these ancillary benefits that we were seeing through polyculture. It wasn't just about weed control. We had a really wet spring. We had a really tough crop year in 2017, and we really paid for our sins. So we ended up folding out the planter 3 times in nearly every cornfield. Every time we would plant, we would get a 3 or 4 inch rain, and it would turn to bricks, and we were out there replanting. And that kind of stuff really gets you frustrated, let me tell you that. But in this field, we were using the wheat to stop the momentum of the heavy rainfall, to infiltrate it, and our soybeans were so much more even, more healthy. Even though we had some nitrogen in the system, we had more nodules because we weren't killing the root hairs with the saturated soil. We just had a lot healthier plant. Also, what you're seeing is kind of a play on the surface area of our wheat heads. So we just have a 7.5-inch wheat on the ground floor, but because we make this wheat tiller, we spread the wheat out. So it might be 7.5 inches down low, it might be 25 inches up top, and the tillers go out sideways trying to find light. The competition makes the top taller, so you get this rounded, wider effect, and you end up getting a surface area of wheat heads 3, 4, 5 times higher than the ground floor. So if we time this with the soybeans to where we may stress them for a short amount of time, we can maximize our wheat yield with a small portion of the ground floor being covered, and then open up the sunlight for soybeans. And this really opened my eyes. We didn't have our equipment really in order. I was really more interested in the agronomy, so we had some wheel damage. We combined this in an angle, just took the heads off. But what I saw these soybeans do was we were adding nodes to our soybeans. And the reason is, like in the garden, we have our pumpkins and watermelons, and if you give them space, they continue to make new leaves all the way up to the frost. You'll see pumpkins getting started, right before frost, and you're thinking, what are you doing? But the soybeans will act the same way. And in our monocultures, like going back to the corn, they are in competition with each other for light. And by using a cereal at the same time, we can occupy that space with a thatch to control our weed pressure, but also open up sunlight down lower into the soybean plant and allow that plant to go outside. So each plant can capture more light, each plant has more energy, and it loses its motive to grow upward for new light. It can get it sideways, so our nodes get more stacked. And I don't know if it's because of that we're getting more. I think it's more that each plant is getting more light. So we ended up getting 75 bushel wheat. Our beans averaged around 50. Where we took out the in-rows, we had some strips in the low 60s. And we had some really good beans kind of in the bottoms where we had a little bit more moisture. But I thought we could do a little bit better for our profitability by cutting out one part of that, and that is the custom application of our manure. Now, I will say we went back to that this year because we were so wet. But because we have such high fertility, I felt we could band our manure, and the goal is to not only move it to new fields, but if we do have to apply it close to the barn, I want to cut our rate by 70 or 80% and I don't want to build our soil, I don't want to build or lower our acidity trying to band that and get it in a plant. So we put a little Gandy box. This cost about $850 with a little bit of tubes, and took out every other row and put our wheat in 60-inch rows with the manure tanker. So this may look really bad. We have a lot of soil disturbance. We are required to inject our manure in our county. So it's just something that we have to do. That's our option. But what we're doing is dropping that wheat up against a deflector plate and using ground speed to get that wheat seed into fluid soil. And then it's placed directly above that manure. And then this is kind of where these dominoes happen with plant multiplication. So this is, we had a couple fields of relay. This is the field in front of our house. Again, we threw the oats in there as well to help with canopy and get a little of that mycorrhizal action going. And you can see how thin the wheat is. So we had 18-pound wheat and 27-pound wheat, which our normal seeding rate is anywhere from 110 to 140. So we really had between $7 to $12, $13 in wheat seed. So if I could do that job myself for $15, having that asset and the fuel and that much wheat, and the dragline guy charged us a penny a gallon, that we are at a net negative managing our manure and getting a crop to kind of get this going. So also the thing we're chasing is as we roll back the no fences, I'm trying to find a system to share this resource to our neighbors. we have this huge variation in our soils compared to a farmer that does not have access to manure. So his phosphorus might be at 20. So what if we come up with a system where we can share this via crop share, via manure share situation? So that's part of the idea here. You can see the radishes and oats, if we do a good job getting that full canopy and choking out winter annuals, they will die without herbicide. Usually we can keep them alive past Christmas. With radishes, if they're very small, they live a lot longer. They can withstand several nights below 15 degrees. If they're bigger, they'll die on a 23, 24 degree. So we can kind of keep them alive and growing. They don't get real big, but through numbers, we're planting about 10 pounds of radishes. It actually costs more than the wheat seed. But we have this copious amount of fertilizer that we're trying to not only recoup what we're applying, but try to access some of that stuff from previous years. So you can see the wheat is still standing there. And this is what you get with that location, location of manure directly underneath the wheat. We trigger plant multiplication. And this is one seed here in our normal, 120 pound, 7.5 inch rows. And the only thing that's really going to produce grain, most likely, is the main stem. That's the only part of that plant that's going to reach up and grab enough sunlight to trigger a grain head. Where since this wheat has that plentiful fertility underneath it, it just grows like crabgrass. And we can get 5, 10, 15, 20 wheat heads depending on its competition from another piece of wheat. But what happens is now that we've made these new tillers, because each one of them can access light, they'll make a grain head. So we're not really shooting for 90, 100 bushel wheat. We're just trying to add value with the manure. We're trying to add value with that specific space at that specific time that's not being utilized in our area. We're trying to help our infiltration. We're trying to help our rotation. So we planted soybeans in 20, 40-inch rows with the wheat inside the 40, and that wheat filled in that gap, and that's where we were planning on running our combine to get away from any combine damage. So here's another picture of that going through time. So this is about 10 days before harvest, starting to change color. And at this point, the soybeans are level with the wheat. There's 10 more days where it gets taller, and we kept getting rain. And I had a field day, and I was really getting nervous that this thing was going to be a disaster. It was getting scary. And I called guys from Flexi Finger, and they came out and actually bought a combine to place and pull this thing off. See them growing taller. So here's our other field. Here's the setup. We have an S680. My grandpa always says, sometimes I'll hide the keys. He doesn't want me to run all night. He says, it's my combine, my rules. So I just bought my own combine, and we can do whatever the heck we want with it. So this video was taken by Purdue University. They came out and droned this field every 10 days, and they came out during the field day. So you can see our tires having wheat at 60 inches and a wide wheat row. We can facilitate those 18.4-inch singles right down the row. You look to the right, we're pinning 2 out of 3 wheat rows down, and I think there's some reflection there of sunlight that's maybe adding even a little bit more energy to those plants. So if we go wider, that's why I really like these Flexi Fingers. We could go to a 40, 45-foot head, and this is all adjustable. This snaps right on to the cutter bar, and this is all slidable, so we can come up with any schematic that we want, anything, and make it work. And we don't just have to do the wheat and soybean thing. I'll show you some other things that we did on our farm. But you're seeing that soybean that's in R2, that's about this tall, being pushed down to about 4 or 5 inches. And the first go around here, I was actually snapping a lot of stems. This plot at my house had anywhere from a 2/8 to 4/8 maturity, and the 2/8 were even further, had a thicker stem, and some of them was snapping, and I thought, oh man, this is gonna be a disaster. But as we got away from them, the soybeans took it really well. So here's another video.
Yeah, Jim Vanessa with me. Say hi, Jim.
This guy was from Canada, he came down. This is running our latest maturity soybeans. These are 4/8.
4/8 beans.
And you can just see how much bigger they were than the wheat. So the soybeans really never really starved for sunlight. They could get it up top. And this really was extreme. You can see some of the green material that I'm coming in. I just couldn't drive it good enough to get a good job. But our wheat ended up making just 32 bushels per acre. That's not nearly as good as in the past, but again, didn't cost as much. And the payout, we were really looking to increase soybean yields. The variety just to the left was 107. To the left of that, 108. These were 106. We had several go over 100. And I don't know exactly what the plot average was. It was somewhere in the 90s.
Oh, mid-September at least. Be a late October harvest, 4/8, talking Arkansas.
So again, that flexi finger was not only used there, the bigger field. We had pearl millet growing in 86-day corn, a really early corn. And also we tried interseeding soybeans and corn just to kind of get an idea of how this stuff worked together. And next year is going to be completely different. And honestly, I don't know exactly what we're going to do yet. All of these things that we go to just gives you more ideas. So this is the day after harvest. And you saw how kind of beat up and down and some residue was on top. It just takes a little bit of light, and it's just like a dog wagging its tail. The beans are very happy. And they've got that pinched down residue on the side, and this is really where the magic happens for soybeans. They each plant, so you're in 20, 40-inch rows, and each plant on one side of it has access to sunlight. So that sunlight was being blocked by the wheat there for a period of 2 or 3 weeks. And now each node has light. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier by intercharging that plant. These beans just continue to grow. The fuller seasons filled in a little bit quicker than the early seasons. And me and my boys were out there about every day making a Twitter video or something. This is in a couple weeks, and you can see how those soybeans are really kind of going through this rapid production mode. And what it allows a guy to do that has really fertile soil, we really struggle with our beans lodging. This really tempers the stalks, adds the nodes, and we can really get some higher yield numbers. So here is a mid-summer video.
So just set a new personal best. Pulled this plant with 26.
And my wife tells me, she said, you know, the first couple weeks that we were together, I thought you were kind of cool, and I figured out that you're just a really big dork, and you're more of a dork every day that I know you. So I think I may be the only one that has about 150 soybean videos online. You get a lot of these. But I can go back and really track the progress and kind of learn from that. But what I'm showing here is how much more production we're getting lower in the plant. I think there's so many more applications to where if we widen rows out and stair-step this intercropping, we can actually have a crop that is going to do better than growing alone.
Live soil right here.
So a lot of those decaying roots are down, you know, that's not as deep as cereal rye, not nearly as deep as pasture, but it's down 2 or 3 foot, infiltrating. The worms really flock to that decaying, and then my soybean roots are growing in there.
That have manure injected, the wheat has taken out the ammonium and has left plant available phosphorus, sulfur, all these goodies, along with living roots and all this biology and worms. And these beans just haven't missed a beat.
I was excited. So the most productive soybean plant I saw had 30 nodes. And I have not seen a monocrop soybean have more than 21 in my lifetime. So we're getting big incremental gains in that metric. And we actually saw a decline on our farm with fuller season soybeans. They got really tall, they looked really good, but we didn't get the grain size down low. Where in the relay, we kept getting incremental gains with later season soybeans. And I think a lot of it is this light infiltration and managing that vegetation and getting more production instead of forage. So we'll go into something I'm not really excited about. There's been people all over the country trying to grow soybeans and beans in a way that captures a little bit more light. I thought instead of trying to do it in 4 or 6 rows and getting the outside rows, let's see if we can do it in a continuous field. So we planted 60-inch corn with a fuller season soybean, 86-day corn, trying to get that out of the way, give some light for soybeans later on, thinking that we could do a lot more on the revenue side with the corn than wheat. We just didn't know how the beans would react. And they didn't react very well. They kind of got a little spindly. I think I can lower the population somewhat. We ended up getting about 130 bushel corn and 35 bushel soybeans. But we're paying for seed for both, and it just didn't really quite get me as excited. But I think it can be tweaked somewhat. And I think it'd be really interesting playing with this concept with cereal rye and having manure with the same intention is, could we come out in the cereal rye, inject manure in really wide rows, like 60 at a low rate, plant our corn there, come back and pin our rye down, plant our soybeans, and kind of go about it that way to lower some costs. Kind of the same ideal here with the flexi fingers. You know, you can drive a car with your foot. It doesn't really make it a good idea. You can combine corn with a grain head. I thought I was doing a pretty good job. There was definitely more loss, but it did do the job decently.
And full house here. If I can drive right, we're doing a pretty good job.
So we also tried some high management plots with our corn, with skip rows, with the idea of being able to implement some kind of relay cropping or rye or cover crop in the future. And we did not find any yield loss with skip rows, which kind of opens up some opportunity for options in the future. So the real driver here is I know that these confined barns are not the future, but it's what we have. This infrastructure is in place. It's manifested to where it's a problem that no one wants to address. You know, you see these algae blooms, but I think we live in a world anymore where we're kind of in these camps where it's either this is evil or this is good. But I think we need to be able to work with what we have. So our direction, hopefully, on our farm is to get away from commodities, get away from confined barns, and go into more of a direct marketing concept. But you got to get started somewhere. So we tried this year with grazing after corn, and we didn't get it grazed. We had a hurricane come up, and we ended up bailing it. But the agronomy really worked well. Same mindset. We had an 86-day corn in 60-inch rows, and we came in and interseeded pearl millet. So the idea in my mind was that if we used a real early corn, we could get it to pollinate quickly and start pollination. And by the time this pearl millet, since it's in 60-inch rows, it's not going to have much stoppage from growth and water uptake once it really gets rooted and going. So we were trying to get the corn to that level, and then the pearl millet really took off. And we got a lot of biomass. This is following spring manure. That's how we really like to manage our manure. On the fall, I'd really like to get to this wheat and intercropping. And in the spring, we can reduce our rate and plant corn. We were trying to grab the ammonium through the pearl millet and the corn here. So this is us harvesting it with the same setup. and the pearl millet heads were at the same height as the corn. So we had a tremendous amount of biomass here. I think it would be really interesting, a guy with irrigation, with grazing, to maybe give up a few bushels of the corn and give that intercrop a head start and see how much they could push the forage yield there. I would like to see that done somewhere. So same deal, 2 kids on my lap, combining this, but you can see how big the pearl millet heads were there. The big mistake here was once we got that pearl millet into reproduction, making its head, when you push it down and it snaps, it's pretty much dead. So if I was wanting to graze it, it'd really make more sense to plant it a little bit later with these wide rows and keep it from getting to that point, so when they would graze it, it would come back. So, that's just a monoculture. I think we can take this idea and run with it with different species and so on. But the corn ended up making around 150, which was about 75 to 100 less than the field around it, but we got a pretty good amount of square bales for my uncle there. So this is really the way that I feel. Anything that you try on your farm is going to change everything else. So I don't really think we're really looking for answers. We're looking for options. Got a little bit of time to talk about what I would like to see on the future of our farm. I think I'll just kind of throw an idea at you. I think I would love to see farmers own their own energy source. I've been thinking, what if we bought our own windmill or solar farm and ran all our equipment off that? And there's a guy from Cadman, Canada, that came out with a continuous manure applicator that we could do some really cool things. We're going to try that in the fall and take the tanks out. But we're talking about the idea of having a power cord and another cord that brings mediums like fertilizer, seed, whatever you need. Hopefully we do it regenerative farming. But I think the future is going to be tractors that run electronically but are also connected to a central source that brings that to the field. And I think that ball is rolling. So if that made any sense, maybe kick that around in your head a little bit. But anyway, thank you for letting me share my story.
Okay, if you've got a question or two, we'll take some. I think we've got some right over here. Just a minute.
Okay, I saw some green leaves going in your combine. What's the moisture on your wheat? What kind of ranges of moisture have you had on your wheat? And if you had any spoilage due to having too many leaves in?
Yeah, so the field day I wanted to plan ahead, and we kept getting rain. And we were supposed to have it Wednesday. We moved it to Friday. We were running 22% wheat there, pretty wet. 2 days later, it was 90 and windy. We got down to about 15. Luckily, we had a field of monocrop wheat that was 11, so we did the old elevator trick and just cut it ourselves. But yes, it was pretty wet at that point.
So how do you handle that, your chemical program in that soybean wheat mix? I mean, how do you not spray it, or do you?
We're using Extend. So wheat is very fickle on the timing. We actually planted the exterior of that field about 3 weeks earlier. We have to delay planting with that amount of energy or our wheat gets big. So we planted, both years here we've used Extend without the Roundup, of course, right before joint. So it takes a lot of scouting to try to time it as late as possible to get your residual. But because we expedite canopy with the 2 crops, we can get it to canopy to go to the finish line. And if we have some foxtail, we can spot it. Really haven't seen much foxtail pressure in those fields with Roundup post-harvest.
Any other questions? Chris?
Jason, what varieties do you use
As far as wheat,
as far as for everything?
We use Pioneer seed. 25 RSWD was our wheat last year. It was 77 the year before. The 74 was much shorter, mostly due to the season, but it didn't have the tillering. And I really want to touch on that a little bit. So a lot of people are relay cropping, and 60 inches sounds wild, but I'm using the manure. But if I'm using 30s, I would increase my seeding rate quite a bit. I would starve it, and I wouldn't want to trigger the tillering. I would want a more upright, more consolidated row. So I would look for a wheat that was, shorter if I had the right harvest equipment, that didn't bush out as much if I wanted to keep it like in a 30-inch configuration.
For the beans?
For the beans, I've tried everything. We're leaning more towards the late season. There at my house, I had 17 varieties. So I had them relay and then non-relay. And the only one that was worse relay was the first pass that I made when I was trying to figure out my height, and I snapped a bunch. We had varieties as good as 12 to 15 bushel better. We had some just 2 or 3. But I think mostly it was the water management and the root health of those soybeans. And then in the big field that we had a 6 bushel yield advantage with the relay soybeans compared to non. So I think there's a spectrum here. We have finite resources, we have sunlight, we have water. We're not taking the whole boat. We're taking a small percentage of it. If we take a small percentage of it and make these infiltration channels, we're just getting healthier roots. We're not starving that soybean. The soybean really wants it drier early on. It doesn't really require a lot of water till later. So if we can just use a little bit, not block a lot of sun, I think as a system we can get some pretty incremental gains. And then you look at the population, we really cut our wheat population utilizing the tilling. We can really cut our bean population as well. You can keep the same row population and omit some rows. So if you're normally 120, you omit some, now you're down to 80. Most of our fields around there are going east-west, and row orientation. We were east-west with both fields. We had some in rows, but it becomes less relevant with the wider rows. And it was a fickle year. We were just so cold in the fall, so cold in the spring. Our wheat was probably 8 inches shorter than normal, so we didn't get that solar blockage. But I go out there every day, and I'm really seeing how much sun is being blocked. And you saw the soybeans rise above it, so there just was not much starvation for sunlight.
One more question over here.
Yeah, just wondering on your corn and oil, how much biomass the oil provided, and did it make up for the loss of money? And I guess if you're going to do something different next year, what does that do?
I don't know exactly yet. I need to find an expert. But we got 5 round bales per acre, large round bales. I don't know how much that it weighed. The corn made 150, 86 day, we gave up some. But I don't even really think we didn't really utilize the whole season like we could have. I think a guy could maybe get some fall rye and maybe cut the rye and then go that and then get something that's going to grow longer and be able to rotational graze several times. So I know I made a lot of mistakes there, but just honestly, what I find, if you can integrate cereal in your rotation and have something growing during your heat waves, or it's growing where the ground's warmer down deep, you can be kind of bad at it and you're still going to get more gains than just trying to condense your growing season down to 60 or 70 days.
Okay, with that, Jason, thank you very much.
Thank you.